that's very much the context of this paper, and the presentation I'll give that's based on it. So the title of it is, as Adam mentioned, Recognition as Acknowledgement, Symbolic Politics and Multicultural Democracies. And I should note also that this is a co-written paper that I wrote with Associate Professor Geoffrey Brahm Levey from UNSW, the University of New South Wales in Australia. It's part of a shared project that we have where we're developing a theoretical, but also hopefully an empirical account of political symbolism and the diverse forms of political acknowledgement that exist in contemporary liberal democracies. So the paper is a little bit kind of, in a sense, our attempt at a kind of meta theory of this, getting our heads around how we should understand the categories and concepts and normative and critical questions that come out of it. So I'll be really keen to see Joe and of course everyone's reactions on that. So we take it as kind of basic or foundational to this type of question that political symbolism is really integral to the social unity of democratic states. How a political community is represented and discussed affects how citizens relationships to each other and to the state particularly. So Michael Walzer observed that symbolic activity is perhaps our most important means of creating the social unity required for political community. He says prior to imaginative symbolization, the union of people, political community, has no palpable shape or substance. The body politic must be personified before it can be seen, symbolized before it can be loved, imagined before it can be conceived. So symbolization creates as much as it reflects political community, insofar as it establishes an understanding of how individuals and groups are linked together or how they're not. Now, despite this, and despite this kind of centrality, which I think not a lot of people wouldn't necessarily argue with, traditionally liberal theory, which has been responsible for a lot of theorization of political community, as well as multiculturalism, which I'll come to later, traditionally liberal theory has avoided theorizing political symbolism, especially in its relation to political identity. We can think of this probably as the result of two fundamental commitments in liberalism. First, liberal theory is generally committed, and liberal states are thought to be generally committed to the idea of neutrality and the idea that states should be neutral among conceptions of the good or ways of life that exist within them. And secondly, that they should be impartial towards their citizens, not favoring one set of goods over another that any group may particularly have. So neutrality and impartiality are construed then as requiring, or traditionally construed then as requiring liberal governments to exercise a kind of hands-off approach to such matters. However, the explosion of, and this is a kind of narrative that we all know, the explosion of grassroots identity politics in the Western world in the 1960s, movements like racial justice movements, feminist gender movements, indigenous rights, subnational forms of secessionism and multiculturalism, the explosion of these types of movements is often thought to have provoked many political theorists to eventually start considering these symbolic questions, as well as key institutional questions as well around how to accommodate these various types of claims. The key issue that we try to address here, and I think we formulate this slightly differently. The key issue that we try to address in this paper is what we call the problem of symbolic inclusion in multicultural democracies. Now, this concerns the extent to which, and also the manner in which, democratic states should respond to their diverse citizens by transforming political identity through the use of inclusive public discourse and the chosen symbols of the state. So to what extent they should actively engage in shaping and transforming the ways in which they symbolize the political community itself. In liberal democracies, these questions tend to arise in relation to situations of minority nationalism, indigenous peoples and the legacy of colonialism, and large-scale immigration programs and the presence of post-immigration groups. Now, different factors really apply in each of these cases. So we're not, at least at this phase, trying to think about this across all those types of contexts. Rather, in this paper, Jeff and I, we really wish to focus on the problem of the symbolic inclusion regarding the immigrant presence. Now, this is a topic that's usually associated with multicultural theory. For example, whatever else it is, multiculturalism is, as Tariq Modood, who we use a lot in the paper, notes, it's an effort in conceptualizing post-immigration difference, the way to understand the consequences of immigration on political community and the ways in which we're responding to each other. And we argue fundamentally that the two dominant philosophical approaches to defending affirmative multiculturalism, what we call cultural rights theory and recognition theory, have had little to say on the symbolic recognition of immigrant groups. And so we're trying to, I guess, plug ourselves into that gap in terms of a multicultural theory of recognition particularly. And the way we do that here, and what I'll be doing over the next few minutes, is to pick up on a suggestion that's made by several scholars, and it's been made in different ways and often quite briefly, and often from very different theoretical perspectives, that recognition be spoken of or reconceived of as a kind of acknowledgement. And we argue that the symbolic inclusion of minorities vis-a-vis the political community involves forms of multicultural acknowledgement that are distinct from the kinds of recognition prescribed by the leading theories of multiculturalism. And this is because forms of acknowledgement, often as they occur, but often as we think they should occur more, are reacting to the fact that minorities may both formally enjoy individual rights and state accommodations, as they do in many states with some kind of multicultural program, accommodations of their cultures, I should say, and yet still be symbolically marginalized. So we're thinking about that context in which there may be a kind of recognition, often institutional or rights-based form of recognition, but alongside it, continued symbolic marginalization of these types of groups. And we suggest that acknowledgement helps us understand that, but also helps us think about why we should do something about that in a certain sense. And we also try to draw some lines around this idea of acknowledgement by offering an early distinction between two forms of acknowledgement. So we attempt at the end of the paper, if I have time, to speak about the difference between what we call general and specific forms of acknowledgement as we see them. And we think that this understanding of acknowledgement provides a kind of conceptual framework for analyzing the symbolic politics of multicultural inclusion. And we're hoping that it helps us develop further work on that coming out of it. So this is all just to kind of give a little bit of a preamble, which explains, I guess, the structure of the paper as I'm going to give it. In the next section after this introduction, I'll critically review the status of the concept of recognition in multicultural political theory, and I'll argue that the leading approaches, as I've already kind of intimated, ill-fit the cases of symbolic inclusion and post-immigration communities specifically. In the section following that, third section, I'll connect the issue of symbolic inclusion to the issue of political belonging. And I'll argue that when multiculturalism is focused on the issue of political belonging rather than cultural accommodation or issues of autonomy, we can reconceive recognition in a way that helps us think about it as a form of acknowledgement. And finally, in section 4, I'll reconceptualize, I'll attempt to offer a kind of initial reconceptualization of recognition for post-immigration communities as a form of multicultural acknowledgement and distinguish those general and those specific forms that I mentioned before. I should also note that I'm really only using these slides to throw up the quotes that I'll be using, just because, as I mentioned before to the organizers, I really find it difficult when someone's presenting and reading quotes up from various authors to actually follow the quotes. I'm not sure why it's different than normal speech, but I just find it particularly helpful, and so I hope you do as well. But otherwise, what I'm saying is not structured through the slides for those of you watching. So recognition is a key concept, I think, as we would all agree, in multiculturalism discourse. It's often framed as what minorities require and as what states owe in some kind of a sense to various types of groups. We argue, unless in the paper, that the concept nevertheless remains under theorizing discussions, and that the major analyses ignore a vital area of multicultural politics, the symbolic immigration of immigrant groups. Now, the centrality of the concept, we think, stems from its seeming kind of fundamental, its seeming kind of explanation of a fundamental shift in recent politics. Now, we all kind of know this narrative, but I think it's a really important one because it tells us why we constantly use the word recognition, both in academic and non-academic contexts these days, right? Most discussions of recognition begin with some kind of history and the idea that something fundamentally transformed or started to change around the 1960s in the politics of Western and liberal democracies. There's a kind of common idea that around this time there was a transition or an expansion from collectivist and universalistic politics oriented around class to particularistic politics around identity and culture, that suddenly groups claiming injustices were doing so in terms of an identity of a subgroup within the nation and not in terms, for example, of issues necessarily focused on class-based differences. And that this is something that's changed and something that's marked our political world. There was constant reference to the idea of identity politics and the various kinds of forms and shifts of identity politics since then, and very much in our time now. Now, the difficulty, I think, of this type of claim and the concept of recognition generally, and particularly as it arises in political theory, is that it's actually kind of dual in nature in many ways. recognition is both an empirical claim about a shift in politics, right? When we talk about recognition as something that's important these days, we're saying something about what groups claim and what they want and how to understand what they want. But we're also making a normative claim about what a situation of justice might require, right? That many would say that justice requires some kind of recognition of people, or treating people as political agents requires recognition, that democracy might require, or that liberal ideals might require, as we'll see in a few seconds. And that's why Lois McNay has, I think, really helpfully talked about this dual nature as recognition as a descriptive tool and a regulative ideal, that it's doing both of these at once, which is why the notion, which she doesn't like, is so difficult that even critics don't seem to be able to get rid of it or get past it. Now, as I've said, recognition in political theory tends to be framed either through what we call cultural rights theory or what we just left as kind of an idea of recognition theory. To take the latter first, I'm going to be talking a little bit about Charles Taylor's seminal essay, The Politics of Recognition, and then I'll move on to more self-described liberal theories of recognition after that. Now, in many ways, this essay, Taylor's essay, remains the most significant theorization of recognition regarding multiculturalism and provides the main account of what recognition for cultural minorities requires. And this is a really long and complex essay that I'm not going to attempt to address too much here. It's originally written as a lecture, which obviously means we have to read it in a certain type of way, and it meanders around a series of different related topics. But there's a few key claims that I would like to pull out and think about. First, Taylor does that exact type of narrative that I already referred to previously. He divides modern political demands into two sorts. On the one hand, he says, there's the politics, and this is quote up there, the politics of universalism and equal dignity, based on the idea that all humans are equally worthy of respect. And this for him has led to a universalistic politics of individual rights in modernity and entitlements that are concerned with the character and relations of shared citizenship. So this is our big kind of politics of equality around fundamental structures like citizenship and the idea that we all are all of equal human worth as humans. On the other hand, he says, and this is obviously what motivates the essay, there is a more recently developed politics of difference, focused on, as he says, the potential for forming and defining one's own identity as an individual, but also as a culture. Now, in this way, Taylor reframes much of modern and contemporary political discourse as claims to recognition, right? These are both recognition claims. Conflicts around equal dignity, where a group or an individual claims their common humanity or citizenship, and demands for equal respect, where individual or group distinctiveness is being ignored, misconstrued, or denigrated, they're both understood as claims to recognition for him. However, Taylor matches or builds into this more empirical account of development of our normative models of politics, a normative account of that clearly values one over the other. This stems from his theorization of what recognition is, because Taylor theorizes recognition and the politics of difference as arising from what he calls an expressivist understanding of freedom tied to the notion of authenticity. Now, expressive freedom refers to the ability, basically, that people have to pursue common purposes through distinctive languages and culture. It's a social form of freedom that requires the group to be able to live by its culture and practices, to be and feel authentic to themselves, basically. And it's for this reason that someone like Nicholas Smith, who's a great Taylor commentator, calls expressive freedom both radically particularized as well as egalitarian in some way. However, the result of these two moves, on my reading of the essay and on others and my co-author as well, is that Taylor ends up prioritizing the politics of difference when he actually talks about recognition. So he sets up this kind of gigantic frame. There's these two types of recognition, but when he thinks about what recognition really demands, it's the politics of difference that gets the main kind of emphasis. And this is I think, really well demonstrated in the work of Lawrence Bloom, who's been a great critic of this essay. He says, while the issue of democratic sameness remains in Taylor's essay, it loses its deeper connection with forms of recognition, becoming instead an institutional structure that grants people equal rights as individuals, or more generally, difference-blind norms for social policy. Rather, by the end of Taylor's essay, it's cultural autonomy, particularly epitomized by the example of Quebec's quest for Francophone survival, that defines the politics of difference. So recognition becomes about cultural survival, and it becomes about the recognition of groups, about their distinctiveness, And equal dignity becomes a kind of claim solely for individual rights in a certain sense, even while he initially talked about it as a form of recognition, something that we would like to retain that sense. Now, our criticism is sort of building on this, is that even on kind of broad and liberal terms, Taylor's dichotomous framing of political demands into two forms of recognition, equal dignity and equal respect, and this kind of idea of a historical shift, paired with a kind of normative account where he ends up privileging one over the other, ignores the symbolic aspects of political inclusion for immigrant minorities. Taylor's account cannot accommodate many of their claims for equality, what role their identity plays in their demands, the place of distinctiveness in their politics, and the different demands such groups are struggling for in relation to the state and their fellow citizens. Particularly, he can't explain why equal dignity can have a symbolic role in the forms of recognition they seek, reducing in a certain sense their forms of recognition to equal forms of citizenship as rights, and ignoring them from recognition as a more kind of symbolic activity. Now, we think this is actually related to and stems from and actually kind of builds on, in a certain sense, indigenous scholars and critics of Taylor's work of recognition, like Glenn Coulthard, who have argued that Taylor's understanding of recognition is actually unduly narrow and would largely either exclude indigenous groups or argue that it maintains a fundamental relation of privilege over subaltern in terms of its understanding. We think this in a certain sense points us towards our own account of why it's not adequate for post-immigration groups as well. So we've got Taylor on the one hand, and we've made our argument that his understanding of recognition doesn't really fit. We also would say that liberal theories of recognition, which really should be fertile ground for developing a specifically multicultural theory of recognition for immigrants, that here too, basically, the implicit and explicit understandings of recognition prove limited. And that's because liberal theories of recognition, as we understand them, seek to achieve equal respect through, and mainly through, redrawing the boundaries of individual rights. So in a sense, they find equal respect within a broadened and more differentiated conception of equal dignity. So their emphasis is kind of the reverse. They want to stick in some ways and focus on how to modify equal dignity and ignore, in a sense, or see that as sufficient for understanding equal respect. And as a result, they don't grapple with the symbolic belonging of immigrant groups to the political community writ large. And we see this as common, at least across a couple perspectives that we see as major in this literature. Both perspectives that reject the idea of the neutrality of the state in relation to culture. So someone like Will Kimlicka, who we'll talk about in a second, and also those who accept the idea of neutrality of the state in relation to culture. Someone like Alan Paton, and I'll say something both about these, while I will focus a bit more on Paton for reasons I think that will become clear. So Kimlicka's liberal theory of multicultural citizenship starts with the position that the liberal state can't be neutral with respect to the cultural differences of citizens, because it has to do things like choose holidays, choose an official language, and so on. The states are just simply not neutral and cannot hope to be. As the state is not neutral in this way, certain cultural minorities or their members can be disadvantaged in pursuing their cultural choices and their attachments. And so Kimlicka concludes that liberal commitments to autonomy and equality warrant the accommodation of group-specific cultural difference, where such accommodation is itself compatible with liberal values. So it treats in this way multicultural recognition primarily as accommodation to existing laws and political legal norms, and then as accommodation specifically of the cultural differences of individuals and groups. Even where someone like Kimlicka entertains the idea of symbolic recognition, he often does so very briefly, and it is usually around issues that are focused on the cultural distinctness of certain types of groups' traditions, such as his argument for awarding large religious minorities a public holiday for one of their festivals, as Christians enjoy with Easter and or Christmas, and how those are built into the state calendar. I think what's more revealing actually is Alan Paton's account, because unlike Kimlicka, Paton's theory of equal recognition makes recognition actually quite central to his theory. It's a central concept and it's a central argument for how he understands equal citizenship. Now, he rejects the standard liberal, or what he calls the standard liberal package, basing his argument for recognition on a different commitment to liberal neutrality. Specifically, he endorses what he calls a hands-on rather than hands-off conception of the neutral liberal state, in support of what he calls a fully proceduralist argument for equal recognition of minorities. However, he also has a very limited and very narrow meaning of recognition. He calls it a form, as you can see up here, a form of accommodation extended by the state to particular conceptions of the good. This move is quite radical in some ways. It upends traditional accounts of liberal neutrality, in which conceptions of the good are precisely what the state should avoid invoking in its policy making. And I'll think of something like Rawls's theory of justice in terms of understanding the centrality of that type of claim to a lot of liberal theory. Patton instead argues that individuals' conceptions of the good are often connected to their beliefs and preferences stemming from identification with a particular group or community that shares a culture. He says, and this is again up on the slide, we care about how they, meaning cultures, fare, says Patton, because we care about the ease with which people having culture-related preferences can access options that correspond to those preferences. So for him, multicultural recognition involves accommodating minorities in a way that empowers them to choose, or choose not to, of course, to maintain those cultures that generate different conceptions of the good. And he pairs this with an argument that recognition only entails equal state treatment. It concerns, as he says, rules, facilities, and resources that require that when a state recognizes some groups, not others, say by taking majority needs, beliefs, and practices into their account and not others, such as in the example of holidays, there's need to level up minorities to an equal standing of recognition. So his two or more cultures are equally recognized when similar, what he calls customized assistance is afforded to both. So unlike Kimlicka and many other defenders of cultural rights, Patton's argument fundamentally focuses on equal recognition and does not make a case for some kind of substantive level of just recognition. He says, if a state engages in some form of recognition, and it is granted that neutrality is a pro tanto requirement of justice, then equal recognition should be required as a pro tanto requirement of justice. So in a certain sense, this is quite different, but for us, we actually see these two approaches as quite similar in many ways, or at least having the same type of limitation. They're both limited by thinking of recognition as formal measures to ensure culture is not a barrier to the freedoms of minority citizens. So Jonathan Seglow has called this a form of narrow recognition. He says that essentially both of these types of positions, or as we read them, both of these types of positions appeal to the principle of non-discrimination to argue that, as Seglow says, members of a group should not systematically receive a lesser share of social opportunities or a greater share of the social burdens merely on the basis that they happen to belong to one rather than another. So both approaches then to recognition, the Taylorian and the kind of liberal in multicultural political theory, are limited for post-immigration communities. Taylor for us is simply not fit for purpose. It suggests activities, cultural survival and goals, just activities and goals like cultural survival that do not address the exclusion of immigrants and their descendants. And while offering important accommodations to minorities, Patton and Kimlicka's model of recognition ignores how equal respect requires not just formal inclusion, but symbolic change as well. And I want to sort of clarify that case by turning now to the concept of belonging, which I think will help, or by thinking about the way in which recognition links to the concept of belonging as a way to kind of fill out that claim that this doesn't speak to post-immigration communities. As we argue here in this part of our discussion, that a theory of multicultural recognition should speak to both aims of recognition, the equal dignity of citizenship and the equal respect of various groups within citizenship. And further, that it should illustrate how these features are not only interrelated, but mutually constitutive. What Tariq Modood calls the interaction and mutuality between the two kinds of equality. So in this section, I'm going to argue that to theorize recognition in this way requires an understanding of the harm of political exclusion and the form it takes for immigrants in liberal democracies. I'll then turn to the concept of belonging and what inclusive recognition really entails. So instead of starting a multicultural theory from the goal of rendering cultural difference compatible with the liberal state, society, or economy, we'd like to follow Modood again in starting from a different point. Now, like Taylor, Modood argues that quote him, the starting point is, for multiculturalism is the politics of recognition of difference or respect for identities that are important to people as identified in minority assertiveness. However, crucially, unlike Taylor, Modood holds that the importance of difference and identity does not stem from the account of moral personhood or the value of authenticity. It's not based on some kind of idea about how we constitute ourselves and how we engage or how we might experience, for example, forms of harm through non-recognition. Rather, Modood begins with the fact or what he calls the fact of negative difference. understood as group differences which have created unequal relations of what he calls alienness, inferiorization, stigmatization, stereotyping, exclusion, discrimination, racism, etc., but also the senses of identity that groups so perceived have of themselves. So negative difference is not about cultural distinctiveness, but about inequality that compromises equal membership and dignity. It's about groups that experience inequality as a result of being seen as different, right? Along some set of metrics, right? Or along some set of features, right? It can be obviously different depending on the group at play. Religion could be important in one, race could be important in another, right? The way in which a group is characterized or sort of susceptible to negative difference will vary considerably depending on the actual group and, of course, the majority society around them. The groupness is kind of the issue. Importantly, though, Mudud argues that this type of the existence of negative difference is also kind of two directional. For him, negative difference often produces what he calls ethnic assertiveness, the attempt to resist racism and stereotyping by counterposing positive images of the group to those often fixated on their own culture. So this is really important for him. Basically, in most democracies, the politics of belonging, the politics of political community involves a dialectic of negative difference and ethnocultural assertiveness. And this is really important for thinking about multicultural recognition. By beginning with these things, negative difference and ethnocultural assertiveness, instead of cultural difference, groupness in multicultural democracies is defined not only from within by minority communities themselves, but also, as Mudud notes, from the outside, from the representations and treatment of the minorities in question. So what's key here then is acknowledging that these groups have been constituted as groups, and that at least partially the constitution of the group in a multicultural society occurs from the outside, from what they have been designated as, or how they have been designated as different, I should say. And this brings us to our kind of key problem in the way we would articulate for multicultural groups and how they are constituted, the problem of symbolic exclusion as it occurs in democratic states. Now, symbolic exclusion we tend to think of in terms of ideas like internal exclusion that scholars like Iris Marion Young have articulated. Unlike external exclusion, which is obvious, which is very overt, say when a group is legally prohibited from participating, internal exclusion is a more subtle and pernicious form that occurs when they have access. Young describes it in this way. She says, having obtained a presence in the public, citizens sometimes find that those still more powerful in the process exercise, often unconsciously, a new form of exclusion. Others ignore or dismiss or patronize their statements and expressions. Such exclusion is indirect, right? It's the product of the social status of some groups and the way their identities are marked by negative differences around culture, religion, race, language, or ethnicity. Their identities, their values and histories, and their ways of speaking and interacting are quite simply outside the norm, and so are either ignored or specifically denigrated. Now, for Young, internal exclusion has the capacity to deeply undermine democratic relations and social communication and compromise citizenship. When a group is constituted as marginal or outside the norm in some way, and this is tied to the identity, they endure a form of exclusion from the political community itself. And this to us raises the concept of belonging. Belonging is a bit of a difficult concept in political theory. It's both used a lot and under-theorized constantly. But broadly, we can think of it as considering the cognitive and affective attachments to others that cement our various forms of groupness, as you can see from the quote there from one of my other works. Belonging provokes questions about the process, about what process and resources facilitate unity or collectivity beyond a mere aggregation of individuals. So to belong to a community is to participate in the life of it, to understand and be understandable to other members of it, and to be able to recognize and be recognized by fellow members. The belonging concerns how a political community imagines the internal relationship with members, what binds them and makes them feel at home in their community. While different governments will, of course, attempt to construct belonging along different models, in general, to belong to a political community, the constituent groups must believe that the polity reflects at least part of what they are, and that they are not merely constituents in, but also constitutive of the political community. They have to see the political community as somehow holding some aspect of themselves as well. And in this sense, belongingness, I think, mirrors the analysis of post-immigration and negative difference that I outlined above. Both the representation of political belonging from dominant actors and the response from various communities that seek to belong affect its prospect and outcomes. And we have to understand that post-immigration communities are particularly situated in this regard, as a sense of belonging is typically cumulative in political communities, right? It builds, right? People don't immediately belong when they enter a new political community. and it's often hard-won for new entrants who are commonly seen as culturally different and who are somehow outside of the national ideal of citizenship and the attributes citizens are meant to have. Formal political membership and rights are, of course, an important and necessary initial step, but belonging it attempts to highlight a much longer process towards social acceptance and really membership in the political community. But this means that post-immigration communities often hold quite different levels of belonging from each other, depending on their relation to the national ideal, the set of symbols, norms, values, and images that define membership and citizenship. We can think of a lot of narratives around good and bad migrants, a lot of narratives about successful and unsuccessful migrants, and lots of different arguments, very commonly represented in the media, around which migrants share Canadian or other values, and those that do not. Some communities may enjoy relative acceptance and even valorization, while others are targeted and marginalized. However, even relatively accepted communities in the post-immigration context tend to find a lower ceiling on their belonging in comparison to the established majority community. All of this really, I think, intensely intimates how belonging depends on and is constructed through recognition. I'd like to bring in a pragmatist thinker for just a moment to kind of fill this point out. Thomas Fawston has recently argued, using the work of Robert Brennan, that we have to think about the way legitimacy operates in liberal democratic states as around the concept of stances. He notes how political subjects, he says, and this is the quote, the last quote on the page here, are forced implicitly or explicitly to take a stance when confronted with authorities that attempt to rule them. Whether they follow or conform to the state's dictates, or whether they resist, reject, or ignore them, citizens always take a position in relation to the legitimacy of the state. And this is also true of states, right? States take positions in relation to various communities. They take stances towards them as communities that either, for example, embody Canadian values or do not, as communities that either, fulfill the ideal of Canadian citizenship or do not. And similarly, various groups take those stances as well. And so there is a complex symbolic activity going on in liberal democracies between various groups and between the states and the state and those various groups in terms of the way in which they see each other and the types of legitimacy they see each other having. In this way, states and citizens really constantly engage in a kind of practical exchange of recognition or the withholding of it. In terms of belonging, this recognition involves acts by states, groups, and individuals that construct the inclusion or otherwise of groups in the political community. And we would say that this activity permeates all levels of political society, with the important caveat that the state's relation to political legitimacy, especially in a democracy, has a really particular effect for identity claims, right? The way the state chooses to represent a political community, and particularly a subgroup's place in that political community, is much more efficacious than, say, the way a minority represents the political community, right? It's going to have much more impact and speak with much more voice in a certain sense than other actors. Which is why we'll argue that there's particular normative responsibilities the state then has to have. So a theory of multicultural recognition on this argument for us must be attuned to this complex symbolic politics of belonging and the way that post-immigration communities challenge the existing forms of recognition within liberal democratic states. So I'll move on now then to come to kind of the last major topic, which is thinking then about what that tells us about multicultural acknowledgement and how that helps us think about recognition as a particular thing in this context. Even with the kind of the connection between recognition and belongingness in view, there remains this kind of question: how do we conceptualize recognition to best address the problem of post-immigration belonging? What kind of recognition speaks to the situation of negative difference, internal exclusion, and unequal belonging that many migrants face? We argue that there's another kind of multicultural recognition that's best conceived of as acknowledgement, where the aim is the symbolic inclusion of post-immigration communities within the political community as equal members. Now, this is actually, the idea that acknowledgement helps us understand what recognition really amounts to is an idea that's been suggested by several authors, often with varying degrees of specificity or with different intents and often with quite different meanings to it. But I'm thinking here people like Patchen Markell, Anna Galliotti, and James Tully. We're going to take James Tully and Patchen Markell as our kind of main cases, mainly because they give the longest accounts of what this is, and also ones that help us build our own account particularly. While each we think has some important insights, though we do differ importantly from each of these in terms of the way that we think about acknowledgement. as well. So finding my place. So Tully, I'll take Tully first. Tully argues that the concept of recognition has tended to presuppose a fixed, authentic, or autonomous identity as the object of recognition. So this tends to be his kind of criticism of a lot of liberal approaches to recognition, that they tend to take these groups and these identities as fixed and autonomous and ignore the complexity of these types of politics. This misunderstands for him the ongoing and practical nature of recognition, which is a political process of struggling for the distinctive good of acknowledgement, as he terms it. Acknowledgement for him involves a kind of certain democratic relation that can occur between groups when they have access to the forms of contestation that set the terms of political community. For example, constitutional revision, right? He says, quote him at length up here, when a group puts forward a demand for recognition, they seek to disclose the misrecognition or non-recognition in the existing rule of mutual recognition of themselves and others, to persuade others it is unjust and intolerable, and display publicly a preferred alternative. The implicated others, whose reciprocal identities are called into question, acknowledge this illocutionary action by responding and entering into a hedonic negotiation. So in this account, recognition is not a state of accommodation, rather it's an ongoing activity of such games of reciprocal disclosure and acknowledgement, as Tully calls them, that underwrite the prospects of political belonging. By being heard and hearing others in turn, especially in formal contexts, they say is, in recent contexts where this, the state has been obligated to consult, for example, indigenous groups about land use, citizens come to identify with their political society by being heard and by having sort of and being addressed in a certain sense as co-citizens, and that this is kind of irrespective for Tully of the success of their actual claims or their contestation. Now, there's some strengths to this understanding as we see them. First, acknowledgement is related to recognition insofar as it taps a set of relations between groups. So importantly, he's seeing acknowledgement as a set of relation between groups, involving how they approach others as part of the political community. Second, recognition, on Tully's view, very clearly becomes an ongoing process as the stances that parties adopt will shift depending on the context and the actual struggle that's being undertaken in the moment. Third, we think Tully's right to tie acknowledgement to political equality. He notes in a paper with David Owen that recognition needs to be understood as acknowledging citizens in ways that are appropriately responsive to their status as free and equal persons or members of the polity. And finally, we think that connecting acknowledgement, I should say, between groups, and especially between the state and groups, connecting acknowledgement to political belonging really demonstrates how the symbolic act of acknowledging others has profound implications for their status. But we still see Tully's kind of falling short of actually thinking about what that means for symbolic inclusion. He tends to exclusively associate acknowledgement with democratic participation, which ignores how certain key actors like governments and states can wield deep legitimizing and delegitimizing powers through public discourse and affect the symbolic inclusion of a group. And he still tends to associate belonging as a result with formal access, right? With access to democratic contestation, which may not be an emphasis on rights, but similarly is an emphasis on a core aspect of institutional citizenship rather than a kind of symbolic politics. Markel, on the other hand, it does something quite a bit different. I mean, he disagrees with Tully in many ways, but like Tully, he rejects the kind of liberal accommodationist understanding of recognition in favor of acknowledgement. For us, though, the key value of Markel's account lies in his dissociation of acknowledgement from the content of the identity being acknowledged. Now, he takes this in a particular direction towards a kind of ontological account that we don't follow him in. So I'm only going to be talking about a very particular aspect of his account of acknowledgement. But it's that aspect where he dissociates acknowledgement from the content of the identity being acknowledged that we think is important. Now, he gets this point from the work of Stanley Cavell, who argues that acknowledgement should be contrasted with knowledge rather than recognition. So not with the concept of recognition, but the concept of knowledge. This is because what matters is not knowing another person directly or even something special about them. What matters, as Markel glosses, is what we do in the presence of the other, how we respond to an act in light of what we do know. This is a really crucial point because since Taylor, and I didn't say that much about this, but since Taylor's essay, multicultural recognition has been closely associated with the idea that it is the content of an identity or culture that is the object of recognition, right? Some actual cultural set of practices or beliefs, right? This is intuitive in a certain way, but it's ultimately quite distracting as well. It makes acknowledgement an act of assessing the identities, practices, cultures, beliefs, and values of others and affirming them. or not affirming them, but then not recognizing them. However, such assessment and affirmation are, in our view, not necessary or sufficient for multicultural acknowledgement, which is aimed at the political belonging of groups affected by negative difference. So building on this, we propose an understanding of acknowledgement as a posture, and I'm kind of defining here, as a posture or act towards others that symbolically includes them as equal members in the political community. Of course, there's quite a bit of legitimate debate to be had about on what equal membership reasonably means beyond formal rights, but that's exactly what kind of acknowledgement is pointing us to, is to give some content to what that means. And I'll make two further points about acknowledgement to try and give some shape to what we mean here. The first is that we see acknowledgement as symbolically politicizing. So liberal democratic societies depend on understandings and practical negotiations of the public-private divide. Now, we can all critique this conceptual division, and I don't know any critical colleagues will want to do that immediately. But in our view, some kind of public-private divide is always operative in some way in every type of society, insofar as there are common understandings, even if they're unclear and even if they're contested, but there'll be common understandings of what is politically relevant and what is not. The issue of multicultural recognition is precisely debate over whether the differences of a certain group are politically relevant. So acts of political acknowledgement where actors take up a stance in relation to the political community are a kind of posture of making something of common concern, in need of common recognition, or its denial. And I think this point is really quite well demonstrated by the work of Thomas Nagel, who was writing on a very different topic when he wrote this, but which captures this property of acknowledgement really precisely. He says the essential function of the boundary between what is acknowledged and what is not is to omit or decline to admit potentially significant material into the category of what must be taken into consideration and responded to collectively by all parties in the joint enterprise of discourse, action, and justification that proceeds between individuals whenever they come into contact. If something is not acknowledged, then even if it is universally known, it can be left out of consideration in the collective social process. We're thinking here of something like, for example, the continuing and very strong debate between various sections of political society over the existence of structural racism. To acknowledge and give credence to the notion of structural racism, for example, from a government, immediately brings in and politicizes the kinds of negative differences that racialized individuals and racialized groups claim to experience in liberal democratic societies. To deny it, obviously, does the opposite. And so that kind of acknowledgement, right, for example, in something like Motion 103, the condemnation of Islamophobia, immediately politicizes the negative difference that Islamic members or I should say Islamic citizens experience, right, in a way that fits into what we think of as kind of multicultural acknowledgement, and in a way which lots of obviously forms of politics in our society would seek to reject. So the role of this politicization for us is really crucial. Publicly acknowledging the importance of ethnocultural diversity or something else like the existence of structural racism makes that diversity an aspect of the political community. This goes beyond merely including its individual members as citizens by making their specific diversity, as well as some of the obstacles and inequalities they might live under, but also just the kind of general fact of diversity, a kind of constitutive aspect of the political community to be recognized. And my co-author, Geoff Levey, has importantly called this, change my slide there, what he calls this, the signification of presence. This is an elementary form of acknowledgement that expresses awareness and acceptance that there are others about in our political community. Unlike classical theories of recognition, it's not about reflecting back an affirmation of the content of identity, but asserting that legitimate presence of others, who do belong. And it achieves this by being fundamentally additive generally, although not exclusively, as a strategy, rather than subtractive. Acknowledging others does usually not require the non-recognition of the majority or established minority groups. As such, it tends to be a kind of piecemeal and ad hoc process, one well suited to the cumulative nature of post-immigration difference. The one that we think can also be deeply transformative. I'll be keen to hear what people think of that. The second key feature of political acknowledgement that we want to point out is its connection to legitimization. Acknowledgement can also be a kind of specific invitation to equal democratic membership directed at some group, and may be necessarily a kind of necessary prerequisite for the political equality of those affected by negative difference and internal exclusion. And again, here we revert to the work of Young, who argues that democratic state responses to the internal exclusion of a group must include an explicit form of symbolic inclusion directed at that group. So what she calls greeting or public acknowledgement is a kind of communicative gesture necessary for democratic equality. Greeting, she says, refers to those moments in everyday communication where people acknowledge one another in their particularity and listen to their opinions and take them seriously. Such greetings we see are preconditions of democratic political community, as they are symbolic gestures of equality that make the presence and legitimacy of a group apparent to all members. So the aim then in this type of activity is to shift the symbolic imagery of the state in a way that allows post-immigration communities to enjoy the same level and sense of belonging as majority community. We can think of something like the Declaration of Heritage Month, or for example, the acknowledgement of particular really important cultural dates that many governments engage in these days as good examples of this. Now, these twin features of acknowledgement, and I'm coming to the end now, so I'll be keen to wrap up, but these twin features of acknowledgement, politicalization and legitimation, really highlight how acknowledgement can take at least two forms, as we say it. So this is kind of an initial distinction we want to make that hopefully will lead to further specificity as well down the road. So we see there at least the possibility of there being two forms of acknowledgement, general and specific forms. General forms of acknowledgement, of multicultural acknowledgement, take the form of recognitions and diversity, recognitions of diversity and of the constitutive role it takes in the political community. And this is important because general acknowledgement is not a recognition of common humanity, because it doesn't acknowledge what we all share, but it recognizes the general presence of those who differ. What is shared here is a kind of consequent valuation of that presence as something important to the community, and a sense that it has altered that community in something changed by diversity and the challenges of overcoming negative difference. In this way, acts of acknowledgement in this general form would include those that symbolically recognize diversity as a kind of historically important effect on and value for a political community. And we're thinking here symbolically of things like very famous metaphors of mosaics, melting pots, and kaleidoscopes that tend to dominate political discourse. Commitments to immigration, to multiculturalism as a project, to inclusion and tolerance, can all be kind of important representations of this valuing. Obviously, things like constitutional, legislative, and policy commitments, all of which Canada has a very strong history of, can be quite demonstrable. But it even goes to much wider uses of political language. On the other hand, specific multicultural acknowledgements are those, as I already kind of intimated in the discussion of Young, are those that address a particular group for inclusion. These acknowledgements are greetings and invitations to full membership in a political community. They signal that that group and all others, that this group belongs. They value and legitimize their presence rather than the content of their specific beliefs and practices, right? It's but their presence. And they serve as bridges to highlight that group's particular experience of exclusion and eventual inclusion in the political life of the nation. So here we're thinking of things like official apologies for past wrongs, official condemnations of racism or exclusion, recognition of significant cultural events, alterations to offensive symbols or histories of, and histories of immigration, for example, can be important state-led acts that assert the equality and membership of a particular group as co-belonging. Now, what's really important about these types of acknowledgements is that they tend to be very time and context sensitive, responding to particular controversies in public discussions, and they're also performative. They're usually repeated in multiple forms and performed for different audiences within the target community and beyond. Now, this is all just to say then that this notion of multicultural acknowledgement is very initial in form, but we think that there's a strong argument for it as well. Just by way of conclusion, I'll just note, because I don't want to reiterate everything I've just said, the concept of recognition, while pervasive in multicultural political theory, we really, our argument is that the two iterations of recognition theory that we presented as kind of dominating the literature, cultural rights theory and Taylor's recognition theory, really do fail to capture a vital area of multicultural politics, namely the symbolic representation of political society and its members. And that building on the kind of suggestion that acknowledgement is an important way of understanding recognition, we think that concept speaks instead to the standing of post-immigration groups within the political community and the importance of symbolic inclusion in this endeavor. And we think here that this actually manages to hold separate but relate the kind of projects of equal dignity and equal respect that someone like Taylor offered us. To be fully effective, the equal dignity of individuals requires a specific practice of equal respect and acknowledgement of people and their groups as being co-constitutive of the political community. And such acknowledgement for us, importantly, does not necessarily require or is not necessarily related to the accommodation of minority cultural practices, which is at least a slightly different issue as well, because of the fact that this form of acknowledgement really does stem from the analysis and the understanding of negative difference that marks post-immigration groups, and that we see it as coming from that kind of analysis and that type of impetus as a result. And as a result, we see it as doing something quite different. I think I'll leave it there and just say thank you so much, and I look forward to Joe's comments and the forthcoming discussion.